You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried beneath 12 feet of stone, sealed by the state of Massachusetts and erased from every church record in the northeastern United States. In 1973, during renovations of an old chapel just outside Salem, workers discovered 847 leather-bound journals hidden beneath the altar. These journals did not contain prayers. They contained diagrams of nervous systems, anatomical studies, dosage calculations, and names. Hundreds of names. The title on the first journal was handwritten in iron gall ink. Volnali. Reversible afflictions and their divine resolutions. It belonged to Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne, one of 3 brothers who operated what history now calls the Divine Healing Sanctuary. But make no mistake, this was no sanctuary. It was a meticulously engineered theater of deception, pain, and death. What happened inside those walls was not medicine. It was ritualized manipulation, refined over 37 years and veiled as divine intervention. Today, I'll walk you through a story that even the Vatican refused to investigate. I'll show you how 3 brothers turned their victims into willing participants in their own slow demise. You'll learn how they rewrote faith as a business model and how they weaponized belief to mask the most sinister operation in early American medical history. But before we begin, I need to warn you, this story is not entertainment. This is a descent into the kind of knowledge that can't be unlearned. If you continue watching, you may never look at prayer, medicine, or authority the same way again. The truth isn't just disturbing, it's designed to dismantle your assumptions. Still here? Good. That means you're one of us, the few who are willing to hear what others would rather bury. Lock the door, silence your doubts. You're not watching a story, you're stepping into a reality that's been hidden in the shadows of your own history. And when you come out on the other side, if you come out at all, you'll be something different than when you began. Let's begin. Welcome to the macabre mystery of the Hawthorne Brothers. It started with a whisper in the pews. An elderly woman claimed her blind husband saw the candlelight flicker during evening mass. A child, once paralyzed from the waist down, stood and walked after midnight prayers. The stories spread like infection, miracle after miracle, all tied to a secluded estate on the edge of Salem, where pine trees swallowed the light and the crows circled like sentinels. Locals called it the Divine Healing Sanctuary, but no one truly knew what went on inside. The 3 men behind it, Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne, Reverend Obadiah Hawthorne, and Ezekiel Hawthorne, kept to themselves, speaking only when it served them, always wrapped in the sacred veil of charity and grace. But they weren't men of God. They were architects of control. And the most terrifying part, they never used force. They didn't need to. They understood something far more dangerous. The human soul craves meaning, especially in suffering. And when faith becomes the only answer left, men will pay anything, believe anything, trust anything just to feel chosen. Cornelius had the credentials, a Harvard education, letters from medical societies across Europe. Obadiah had the voice, velvety and thunderous, capable of reducing congregations to weeping confessions. And Ezekiel? He was the ghost behind the curtain, a chemist with no formal training but a terrifying intuition for how to break the body and rebuild it, just enough to make it look miraculous. They chose their victims carefully. Travelers, widows, sick children with grieving parents. But not all were sick. Some were made to believe they were. A touch of dizziness here, a fainting spell at market, a sudden rash or tremor. Ezekiel's compounds worked silently, delivered in teas, tinctures, and oils gifted in the name of faith. When the symptoms arrived, the victims were told it was a sign, a divine test, and that healing awaited them. Faith, or a price. This was never about money, though. It was about control, psychological captivity, turning agony into worship. And the truly sick, the ones who couldn't be fixed for the camera or resurrected for the crowd, they were eliminated quietly, written off as too pure for earth, and families wept in gratitude, believing God had taken them home. You think you're safe because it happened in the 1800s, but the method, the psychology, the way belief is weaponized, that never went away, it evolved. And if you think this is just a ghost story, you're not ready for what comes next, are you? The estate itself was designed like a trap disguised as a sanctuary, a sprawling colonial mansion layered with charm and reverence, white shutters, weathered stone, a chapel dome that caught the sun like a halo. But below the surface, beneath the pews and polished floors, was a basement that reeked of sulfur, iron, and secrets. Hidden behind the altar was a false wall, one you couldn't open unless you recited a psalm in Latin backwards. Beyond it, the real heart of the operation, Ezekiel's laboratory, not a place of healing, but a chamber of chemical warfare dressed in sanctified silence, shelves lined with powders that paralyzed nerves, liquids that induced blindness, syringes labeled not with names but with symbols, serpents coiled around chalices, inverted crosses, and a single recurring motif, an eye bleeding. Every substance Ezekiel created had a twin, a poison, and its antidote. And it was this duality that made the brothers untouchable. They could cause illness at will, then cure it as though touched by God. Cornelius documented every case meticulously, filling journals with Latin terminology, diagrams of decaying organs, and false testimony from healed patients. Obadiah crafted the narrative, tales of divine power, carefully scripted sermons, and testimonials delivered from the pulpit by actors disguised as the redeemed. But perhaps the most twisted aspect of the sanctuary was its ceremony of initiation. New patients weren't just welcomed, they were cleansed. Obadiah would lead them into the chapel for midnight prayers, while Ezekiel's compounds did their work behind the scenes. Fainting spells, hallucinations, fevers. When the body began to break, Cornelius would step in with compassion, with hope, with answers. It was psychological demolition disguised as faith-based care. And the families? They never questioned it. They wanted to believe. And the Brotti, hers gave them exactly what belief demanded: mystery, suffering, sacrifice, and then salvation. It worked for over 30 years, until one woman asked the wrong question at the wrong time, and what she discovered unraveled one of the most sophisticated manipulations in American history. But even then, no one was prosecuted, no graves were dug, no apologies issued. Because when institutions fear what a truth might unravel, they don't confront it, they bury it, just like they buried those journals, just like they buried the names, and just like they've buried the real reason this story was never supposed to reach your ears. There's a reason the Hawthorne estate was built over the bones of a Puritan graveyard, and it wasn't coincidence, it was ritual. You see, Cornelius believed that land remembered trauma, and that energy, real or imagined, could be harvested. That's why they chose Salem, not just for its isolation, but for its scars. The witch trials, the hangings, the buried hysteria, he called it residual divinity, a sacred rot. A place where faith and fear had once blurred so violently it left the soil vibrating. Ezekiel too believed in this energy, but his belief was darker. He saw suffering as currency. The more confusion, the more desperation, the more chaos a patient experienced, the more potent the illusion of healing became. Their treatment protocol wasn't random. It followed ancient patterns, cycles, ritual steps. First came the affliction, induced through Ezekiel's tonics, often days before the patient ever stepped foot on the estate. Then the revelation. Obadiah would divine the illness during an emotional sermon, often publicly, making it seem as if God had whispered the truth directly to him. Then came the descent. The patient would be isolated, deprived of sleep, subjected to fasting and prayer baths, a euphemism for chemically laced immersion designed to weaken the body and disassociate the mind. Finally, the ascension, the antidote given as communion wine. The paralysis would ease, the tumors would vanish, sight would return. And to the patient, half-starved, half-hallucinating, it felt like a miracle. It was a miracle, because miracles don't require facts, they only require belief. And the Hawthorne brothers understood something few ever do. If you control a man's belief, you control his reality. Now ask yourself, who else uses that playbook? Who else diagnoses you with invisible illnesses, offers you salvation for a price, keeps you just sick enough to stay dependent and labels dissent as heresy? The game hasn't changed. The players just wear different robes, sometimes doctors, sometimes politicians, sometimes priests. but always shepherds leading sheep into silence. This is why this story matters now, because the technique didn't die in 1871. It evolved into pharmaceutical campaigns, into televised evangelism, into controlled narratives labeled as "trust the science," into institutions that manufacture despair, then sell you hope in bottles and pills and flag-wrapped promises. The deeper you go, the colder it gets, not just in the ground beneath the chapel, but in the lies that freeze history itself, because this wasn't just about three brothers. No. The Hawthornes weren't acting alone, and they weren't rogue. They were protected, shielded by silence, praised by the church, and quietly funded by institutions that claimed to despise everything they stood for. Harvard's medical board never revoked Cornelius's credentials, despite dozens of whispered complaints and 3 deaths that were quietly ruled as divine timing. Not a single formal investigation was ever launched. Why? Because the brothers had something far more powerful than faith on their side: leverage. In 1842, a prominent senator's daughter named Catherine Belmont was healed at the sanctuary. She'd been struggling with unexplained paralysis. She walked out of the chapel 3 weeks later. Her father never asked why or how, but he made sure no laws ever touched the brothers. In exchange, the Hawthornes treated 24 other political families off record, families that couldn't risk the press knowing about their afflictions, or worse, their secrets. These weren't just healers, they were cleaners, rewriters of reality, and when skeptics started digging too close, they were discredited, quietly removed from their positions. One investigative journalist, Theodore Gaines, published a short exposé in 1849 titled "The Anatomy of a Divine Deception." His paper mysteriously burned to the ground 2 nights later. No arrests, no follow-ups. Gaines disappeared that same week. Witnesses say he boarded a train to New York. He never arrived. Now, let me ask you something uncomfortable. If 3 men in 1830s Massachusetts could manipulate hundreds, silence investigations, and buy the loyalty of powerful elites using nothing but charisma, poison, and a Bible, what do you think today's institutions are capable of, with unlimited surveillance, digital control systems, and mass psychological profiling? The only difference is scale. You think you're safe because you have facts, science, technology, but those are just modern myths. The real weapon is consensus. The illusion of truth created when enough people stop asking questions and start repeating headlines. That's what the Hawthornes understood before it had a name: manufacture belief, exploit trust, and when doubt rises, call it evil. There was one patient who broke the cycle, one name that never made it into the final journal: Jonathan Greaves, 28 years old, a carpenter from Danvers, healthy, strong, devout, too devout. He had come to the sanctuary not for healing, but to offer his services. Volunteer work, he said. A man of faith wanted to serve men of God. Cornelius was skeptical. Obadiah mistrusted his smile. But Ezekiel, he saw potential. And so they let him in. For 3 weeks, Jonathan worked in silence, repairing the chapel floorboards, carrying water to the lower chambers, observing every movement inside that house. And he watched, not just with his eyes, but with the kind of intuition that makes men dangerous. He noticed the symbols etched behind the altar. He saw the vials being swapped late at night. He overheard a whispered argument between Cornelius and Obadiah about dosage correction. But the final crack came when he found a patient in the East Wing, a boy, no older than 13, writhing in his sleep, whispering the same word over and over: thorns. That boy died 2 nights later. Jonathan was told it was divine will, but he wasn't a fool. He had buried enough bodies in Danvers to know what dying from poison looked like. He confronted Ezekiel that night, and what Ezekiel said chilled him. "You're asking the wrong questions," he whispered, "because you still believe this is about healing." Jonathan fled the next morning, not quietly, not cleanly. He wrote letters to the Danvers Town Council, to the Boston Tribune, even to the diocese. One by one, the letters vanished. His name, smeared as mentally unstable, accused of drunkenness, disgraced. A month later, Jonathan was found hanged in his workshop. The local paper said suicide, but the knot was tied behind the neck, military style, a method not known to civilians. And yet, before he died, he left behind one thing no one could erase: a journal. hidden behind a wall panel. In it were detailed diagrams of the sanctuary, lists of names, symbols he'd copied from the vials, and this single handwritten line: "They are not healing the sick, they are harvesting belief." Think about that. Let it sink in. Because belief, when extracted, manipulated, and weaponized, becomes the most profitable disease in history. By the time 1850 rolled around, the Hawthorne Brothers had become something else entirely. Not doctors, not clergymen, not alchemists. They had ascended into myth, living relics of holiness in a country obsessed with salvation. Newspapers printed puff pieces, pilgrims came by the hundreds, some crawling up the sanctuary steps on bloodied knees, begging for mercy, and still, no questions, because the illusion was perfect. But here's the part they never tell you. The closer someone gets to untouchable, the more dangerous they become. You stop doubting them. You stop asking where the bodies go. You stop wondering why everyone gets better or disappears. And the Hawthorne Brothers knew this. They cultivated awe like farmers grow crops, carefully, seasonally, with blood in the soil. By now, their rituals had evolved. No longer content with single miracles, they began staging group healings. 20 patients at once, paralyzed war veterans rising to their feet, tumors that fell away like ash, blind women who described colors they hadn't seen since childhood. All carefully staged, all precisely timed. Obadiah would start with a sermon, his voice slow, trembling, building into a crescendo that shook the chapel rafters. Then Cornelius, the healer, would emerge holding a vial of divine medicine, glowing faintly due to bioluminescent bacteria harvested by Ezekiel from decomposing sea creatures. It looked holy. It smelled holy. It was chemistry cloaked in glory. And in the back, behind the curtain, Ezekiel adjusted dosages, pulled levers, managed temperatures, even controlled lighting with early gas lamp tricks to make halos appear around the patients. These weren't ceremonies, they were productions, and the audience, always the same, desperate, devout, and willing to surrender everything for hope. But there was another change during this time, something darker. The brothers stopped administering antidotes to every patient. Some they simply left in the ritual chamber overnight. The weak ones, the doubters, those who asked too many questions. In the morning, they were gone. Taken by God, they claimed. Bodies were never returned to families, just ashes, always ashes. You're beginning to understand now, aren't you? This was never about curing disease. It was about dominance, the dominion of perception. And when you control what people see, you control what they believe. When you control what they believe, you own their soul. There was a phrase Obadiah repeated often, almost like a mantra. Faith is the currency of control. He would whisper it to the staff when the patients couldn't hear. And those 6 words became the foundation for what came next. Because by 1853, the brothers weren't just staging miracles anymore. They were engineering a cult, a quiet, elegant empire of obedience. They called it the Order of Divine Reclamation. It was never advertised. You couldn't ask to join. Membership required witnessing a complete transformation inside the sanctuary, and more importantly, proving your loyalty by keeping the secrets that came after. These were donors mostly, influential men, business owners, senators, even 2 bishops. Men who watched the charade unfold, saw the antidotes administered, and still praised it all as holy. Why? Because the Hawthornes offered something more than healing. They offered power, the ability to erase affliction, to command crowds with sermons that broke people open and stitched them back together with fear. The order was a shadow congregation, one that didn't pray but plotted. They funded expansions, helped establish satellite clinics in Maine, Rhode Island, and even New York under different names, all while ensuring no lawman, no reporter, no grieving family could touch the original sanctuary. And what did these members receive in return? Access, protection, and knowledge. Because here's the part you weren't supposed to hear. Deep within the sanctuary, past the lab and storage chambers, was a locked room called the Archivum Vitae, the archive of life. Inside were not just patient journals, but something older. Ancient manuscripts, scrolls, pages written in a language no one had spoken aloud in centuries, Cornelius had found them during his studies in Europe, hidden beneath a monastery in Bavaria, pages that described not just medicine but manipulation, rituals practiced in early religious sects, ways to induce ecstasy, obedience, even hallucinations using scent, sound, and temperature. The sanctuary's healing chamber was modeled exactly after these blueprints. What happened inside wasn't prayer, it was programming. And that's the truth the order protected, not just that the Hawthorne brothers had fooled people, but that they had rediscovered something terrifying, that humans can be broken and rebuilt with nothing but ceremony, belief, and well-timed lies. You feel that chill running down your spine? Good. It means you're waking up. The deeper we dig, the more the line between faith and fear dissolves. That was the Hawthorne brothers' genius. They didn't erase the line, they made you forget it was ever there. And by the time the sanctuary reached its peak, that line had vanished from every mind that stepped through its doors. By 1855, they weren't just treating patients, they were selecting devotees, people who would defend them at any cost, people who had witnessed what they believed were real miracles. And that's the twisted brilliance. Once you think you've witnessed the impossible, your loyalty is no longer rational, it's religious. You become a soldier in a war no one else can see. That's what they harvested most of all. Not blood, not money, not even obedience, but devotion. There was a woman named Eleanor Cade, a schoolteacher from Vermont. Her son arrived at the sanctuary with a brain tumor that no doctor could operate on. They told her he had 6 weeks to live. But after a month at the sanctuary, he returned home healthy, smiling, without a trace of illness. Eleanor fell to her knees in the chapel, sobbing, praising God for the miracle. But here's what no one knew. Eleanor's son never had a tumor. He'd been slipped a compound in his hotel room on his way to Salem, one of Ezekiel's early-stage agents that mimicked intracranial pressure. Headaches, memory lapses, seizure-like spasms. They faked the condition, then cured it. What did they get in return? Eleanor became one of their most powerful disciples. She wrote for the Salem Medical Review, defending the sanctuary from critics. She recruited over 80 new patients through lectures and correspondence. She testified under oath during a Senate hearing that her son had been raised from the edge of the grave. No one ever told her the truth. Why? Because truth was never the point. You see, the Hawthornes understood a chilling principle. If you give someone an identity rooted in salvation, they will protect their savior more fiercely than their own blood. That's what makes cults unbreakable. That's what makes institutions unstoppable. It's not fear that binds the faithful, it's gratitude. And that's the part most men never see. They think their chains were forced on them, when in fact, they forged them with their own hands, one miracle at a time. By 1857, the Divine Healing Sanctuary had become a fortress, not of stone, but of narrative. Every room told a story, every hallway whispered legend, and every patient who walked out whole became a living testament to the myth. But myths require maintenance, and the brothers had grown masterful at it. Cornelius sharpened the science, Obadiah perfected the theater, and Ezekiel began experimenting with permanence. No more temporary afflictions, no more simple reversals. He wanted lifelong loyalty, and to achieve that, he needed something more than antidotes. He needed transformation, so he created a compound called Vita Somni, life from the dream. A mixture derived from South American datura plants mixed with trace mercury and calcified rose ash. In small doses, it induced vivid visions. In higher doses, it rewrote memories. This was the brothers' final evolution, the manipulation of not just belief, but identity. Patients began reporting dreams that weren't theirs, visions of walking with angels, speaking with Christ, being chosen for holy missions. And those dreams always pointed back to the sanctuary, always back to the brothers. One patient, Elias Monroe, a banker from Connecticut, returned home after a month-long stay and gave away his entire fortune. Why? Because he claimed God had spoken to him in a vision, promising eternal life if he helped build the new Eden. That's what he called the sanctuary, Eden. But what Elias didn't know was that he had been dosed nightly. His mind wasn't touched by heaven. It was rewritten by a man in the basement with a mortar and pestle. Now let me say something to you directly. If you've made it this far into the descent, you've already felt something shift. You feel it in your gut, in the back of your neck. A suspicion, a realization that maybe the world you trusted wasn't built on truth. Maybe it was built on repetition, on symbols, on fear, and maybe, just maybe, your beliefs were engineered long before you ever had the chance to choose them. If you're still listening, I want you to pause right now and comment the phrase, "I was blind, but now I remember." Write it twice, once for you, once for the man you were before this truth reached your ears. This is not entertainment. This is transformation. And we're not finished yet. Now we enter the blackest chamber of all, not beneath the chapel, but behind the veil of history itself. Because by 1859, the Hawthorne Brothers were no longer healing individuals. They were testing control systems. Entire groups, orchestrated outcomes, emotional and psychological engineering on a scale that hadn't been seen since the days of the Inquisition. But this time, there were no burning stakes, only whispers, chemicals, and choice that wasn't really choice at all. They began selecting entire families, entire lineages to test what they called generational reclamation. One such family was the Devlins from Hartford. 3 generations, grandfather, daughter, grandson, each with a different fabricated condition, each brought into the sanctuary under the guise of unique afflictions, chronic pain, hysterical blindness, selective mutism, all induced, all timed, each given individual treatments. What they didn't know was they were part of the same experiment. Could belief be inherited? Could faith in a system become so embedded, so entwined with identity, that even children born later would remain loyal without ever asking why? The results were chilling. The grandson, Peter Devlin, would go on to become a lay preacher in upstate New York, founding a church called the Temple of the Returning Light, its sermons identical to Obadiah's, word for word. He died at 74, never knowing his family had been programmed. But this didn't stop at religion. In 1861, the brothers created what they called the contingency model, an operation built for collapse. They intentionally chose patients they could not heal, patients with real terminal illnesses. They documented everything. They dosed, prayed, performed every rite, but ensured failure. Then they watched the aftermath. Would followers blame God, themselves, or would they blame those who questioned the sanctuary? And it worked. Every failure became fuel for fanaticism. They died because they didn't believe hard enough. That was the new doctrine. Understand this, the brothers weren't experimenting on flesh. They were experimenting on belief, on perception, on the mechanisms that control how entire societies decide what is true. And tell me, how different is that from the systems you live under today? Medical charts replaced by algorithms, preachers replaced by pundits, holy oil replaced by pharmaceuticals. But the game, still the same. Break the mind, rebuild the narrative, control the herd. We've only scratched the surface. They say history is written by the victors, but what they never tell you is that the true victors are the ones who write the sickness and the cure. And by 1863, the Hawthorne Brothers weren't just rewriting medicine or miracles, they were rewriting reality. One word at a time, one family at a time, one generation at a time. The sanctuary had become a hub of experimental theology, black alchemy, and psychological conditioning masquerading as salvation. But something shifted that year, something the brothers hadn't anticipated. It began with a defector, a man named Malcolm Gray, a pharmacist's apprentice from Boston who had been hired quietly by Ezekiel to help catalog new compounds. Malcolm was sharp, methodical, and, most dangerously, curious. Over time, he began comparing Ezekiel's formulas with modern pharmacology and discovered horrifying truths. The healing agents being administered weren't miracles, but chemically staged phenomena. Paralytics, neurotoxins, alkaloid-induced hallucinations, and mercury-based memory disruptors. Malcolm stole a journal, not one of the leather-bound tomes presented to the public, but a raw, unedited logbook from Ezekiel's hidden archive. Inside were chilling entries. Subject number 216, symptoms induced, full body rigidity, voice suppression. Recovery time estimated, 9 days post-antidote. Note, patient displayed resistance, administered sleep paralysis overlay compound to ensure docility during prayer ceremony. This wasn't healing, it was ritualized biochemical slavery. Malcolm fled, tried to alert a physician friend in Cambridge, tried to publish what he'd found in a local scientific journal, but 3 days before the article was set to run, he was found dead in his boarding room. Overdose, they said. Self-inflicted. But witnesses claimed he hadn't touched a drink or a drug in years. His mouth was foaming, his hands curled like claw. Classic signs of strychnine. But one page survived. One single page of the journal he'd copied and hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It surfaced decades later in an anonymous estate sale. The handwriting matched Ezekiel's. The final line: "Obedience is a side effect of fear, but worship must be manufactured chemically." That page now resides in a private collection. The owner, unknown. The location, redacted. But that sentence alone has been used in psychological warfare manuals and covert behavioral influence programs ever since. Now look around you. How much of what you believe was ever your own? We're not done. By 1865, the Civil War was ending, but another war was just beginning. A silent war, a war not fought with muskets or uniforms, but with ideas embedded beneath skin-deep faith and institutionally approved salvation. The Hawthorne Brothers understood something that most governments still don't. People don't fight for truth. They fight for the illusion that comforts them most. The divine healing sanctuary no longer needed miracles to thrive. It had become self-sustaining, a closed system of belief, experience, and emotional currency that generated loyalty stronger than blood. But now the brothers wanted more. Not just influence, not just wealth, but permanence. Immortality, not of the body, but of the doctrine. So they began recruiting scribes, not publicists, not journalists, ghosts, men and women whose job was to reshape the origin of the sanctuary into scripture. They rewrote patient testimonies into sacred texts, turned fraudulent procedures into divine parables. Entire books were fabricated and placed anonymously in church pews throughout Massachusetts, bound in cracked leather, aged with vinegar, and written in a language that mimicked 17th century Calvinist sermons. They called it the Gospel of Deliverance. But here's the sick genius. The book never once mentioned the Hawthornes by name. It spoke only of the three, the sons of reclamation. It never claimed to be fact, only recorded testimony, and that gave it plausible divinity. Within 5 years, 19 independent churches across the Northeast were quoting from it. By 1870, pastors were preaching its phrases, "Where the body is touched, the spirit remembers. Only the afflicted may know the shape of the divine." These weren't scripture. They were neuro-linguistic triggers pulled from the sanctuary's own experiment logs. And it worked. People wept in pews over stories that never happened, confessed sins to absolvers who were trained by men tracing their lineages back to Obadiah. The brothers had achieved their ultimate goal, a belief system that could replicate itself, one no longer dependent on the laboratory, or the compound, or the chapel. They had made faith viral. And just like a virus, it embedded itself deep into culture, into policy, into education. Long after the brothers disappeared, their code of influence remained. Now ask yourself, when you feel that tug in your chest, that pull toward reverence, are you sure it's God, or is it chemistry? The records claim that the Hawthorne brothers died in 1873, quietly, in peace. Obadiah, the last to pass, surrounded by followers who believed they were burying a prophet. But the records lie. They always have. Because there are no official death certificates, no graves, no autopsies, just a sealed affidavit signed by a single coroner in Salem who disappeared the following winter. And from that point forward, the brothers became legend. But legends don't fade, they mutate. And that's what happened in the decades that followed. Their sanctuary was shuttered, then quietly converted into a mental hospital in 1881. Official reason, repurposing for the benefit of public health. But the layout remained unchanged. The chapel became an auditorium, the treatment rooms became wards, and the basement, still locked, still sealed with lead and iron. No one allowed inside, except one. Dr. Franklin Harrow, a neurologist from New Haven, was assigned to oversee a transfer of patients in 1894. He kept journals, and what he wrote will haunt you. They do not behave like the mad. They behave like the faithful. They hum songs I've never heard, melodies with no origin. They press fingers to their temples and mutter the same phrase, "The three wait in the hollow." These weren't just patients, they were resonating. What Harrow discovered, though he never said it aloud, was that the sanctuary hadn't just left behind architecture, it had left behind echoes. Ritual space, you see, can hold memory like stone holds heat. Repetition creates psychic fingerprints. The healing chamber wasn't just where people were treated, it was where identity was rewritten, faith was injected like a serum, and that energy doesn't die when the bodies leave, it lingers. And what happened next was worse. The hospital began to attract a strange type of patient. Wealthy families sending away difficult heirs, clergy members requesting rest after crises of conscience, and every one of them, after spending time in the lower halls, emerged with a strange calm, a detached devotion, a silence that didn't feel peaceful, but programmed. Then, in 1903, without warning, the hospital burned to the ground. Official report: faulty electrical wiring. But no wiring had been installed. The real story: a nurse claimed she saw Obadiah walking the third floor the night before, a man who hadn't aged, a man who spoke in scripture that hadn't yet been written, and then he vanished. There's a term in occult psychology, resonant recursion. It means that certain patterns, rituals, words, even architectural shapes can reopen a state of mind long after the initiators are gone, like echoes that loop through time, pulling people back into someone else's dream. And that's exactly what the Hawthorne Sanctuary had become after the fire. Not ashes, not ruin, but a portal, a psychic scar still pulsing beneath the soil of Massachusetts. Because the fire didn't destroy everything. Beneath the rubble, search teams found something strange. Not bodies, not Bibles, but iron safes, sealed, heat-proof, hidden deep under the foundations of the old chapel. Inside were 12 black volumes, charred at the edges but intact, each handwritten in an unknown cipher. Linguists, cryptographers, even the military tried to decode them. They failed. But here's where it gets darker. In 1911, one of those black volumes was stolen. The thief? A linguist named Daniel Worth, a quiet man, respected, specialized in ancient religious dialects. But after accessing the safe under government clearance, he vanished, left his home, abandoned his wife, burned his own research. For 7 years, no one knew where he'd gone, until a rural sheriff's deputy in upstate New York discovered a makeshift chapel deep in the woods near Adirondack Park. The man they found inside was Worth, aged, gaunt, mumbling in tongues. Surrounding him were journals, walls etched in blood and charcoal, and the remains of 3 local townspeople who had willingly offered themselves, according to a note found at the scene. On Worth's body was tattooed a single phrase, repeating across his chest and arms: "The 3 return when the witness remembers." He wasn't mad, he was activated. What had started as fraud had become scripture. What had begun as manipulation had become a mimetic infection, spreading through minds, language, symbols, a contagion of belief. You see, the real horror isn't that the Hawthorne brothers lied, it's that they may have uncovered something ancient, something real, something older than medicine or faith, a mechanism buried in the brain itself, a dormant receptor for worship, obedience, transformation, and they didn't invent it, they triggered it. There is a file buried in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, catalogued under an unrelated land dispute, mislabeled, half-burnt. Most researchers overlook it. But inside that file is a map, faded, water-damaged, marked in the margins with 3 overlapping circles and one chilling Latin phrase: mens recepta est. The mind has been received. That map leads to the outskirts of what used to be the Hawthorne estate. But what's truly disturbing isn't the location, it's what was found beneath it during a 1951 private excavation conducted under the guise of soil analysis for post-war agricultural development. They unearthed a chamber. Not a basement, a chamber, octagonal, 12 feet underground, lined with limestone imported from southern France, material that hadn't existed in colonial America. In the center, a stone platform, etched with the same three-circle sigil found on Wirth's body. Carved along the inner walls were phrases in an indecipherable language, but with one exception, a single English inscription carved later with surgical precision. "This is the nerve of belief." The team that found it vanished. 6 men, no trace. Their families were paid out quietly, all records sealed, all equipment confiscated. The site, filled with concrete within 48 hours, a dairy farm built over it 6 months later. But one man left notes. A geologist named Alan Percival, who mailed his journal to his brother 2 days before the disappearance. That journal contains descriptions of audible frequencies, sounds heard in the chamber that did not register on equipment yet caused uncontrollable emotional states. Percival wrote, "I felt like someone was remembering me into existence. My thoughts weren't mine. I didn't believe I was being believed." And now we reach the edge. Because this is no longer about history, no longer about 3 brothers. It's about a technology of the soul, weaponized in plain sight. Not wires, not screens, not satellites, but ritual, story, symbol, and we are still inside it. Every time a man kneels and weeps at an altar, every time a child prays out of fear of hell, every time a crowd chants a name they were told meant salvation. They called it the divine framework. But it was never about divinity. It was about compliance. By 1963, long after the Hawthorne name had been erased from the official records, echoes of their doctrine had slithered their way into something far more insidious. Public institutions, schools, hospitals, churches, military chaplaincy programs, anywhere the vulnerable gathered and the obedient were forged. And at the center of this quiet integration was a government initiative hidden behind patriotic language, codename Project Sentinel. You've never heard of it, not in textbooks, not in documentaries, not even in declassified reports, because its methods weren't chemical, they weren't even violent, they were spiritual, designed to explore the neurological roots of faith-based obedience, and you can trace it all back to a single memo, unearthed decades later. Subjects exposed to encoded doctrine over a 90-day period exhibit increased compliance, emotional dependency on authority figures, and mild euphoria during ritual repetition. Recommend adapting Phase 2 for educational institutions. Now ask yourself, what is Phase 2? Phase 2 was mimicry, the replication of the sanctuary's control protocols, repackaged, sanitized, and distributed through harmless mediums, curriculum, television sermons, motivational speeches, even bedtime prayers. They weren't teaching you how to think, they were teaching you how to surrender. Why do you think the Pledge of Allegiance mirrors ritual chants? Why do hospital patients still wear white gowns, remain in isolated rooms, and place their hope in figures clad in symbols of authority? The same structure, the same playbook, just without the chapel. But the scariest part? Most of those who continued the work didn't even know they were doing it. That's the brilliance of recursion. You don't need to be evil to do evil. You just need to follow the model. That's how systems survive, not by violence, not by law, but by belief embedded so deeply, no one even thinks to question it. And you, man listening to this now, you are standing at the edge of the veil. Ask yourself honestly, how many of your convictions, your deepest, most sacred beliefs, were ever chosen, or were they installed? This isn't history. This is surgery of the soul. There's a reason why the Hawthorne framework wasn't eradicated. It was absorbed because by the late 1970s, intelligence agencies weren't just studying belief systems, they were engineering them. And guess what model kept surfacing in their black budget studies? The sanctuary. Declassified fragments from MK Ultra's adjacent projects show multiple references to a pattern referred to internally as ritual affliction deliverance, abbreviated RAD. Sound familiar? Induce suffering, isolate the subject, control the narrative of healing. The Hawthornes had unknowingly perfected the formula decades before psychotropic drugs ever entered the picture. But now, with modern tools, the manipulation scaled. Enter Project Chimera. a psychological operations directive hidden under medical advancement research, funded by grants that funneled through front organizations like the Panacea Institute and the New Dawn Initiative. Their focus? One chilling question: can controlled trauma, paired with ritualistic framing, create lifelong loyalty to an unseen authority? They didn't need to test it in laboratories anymore. They tested it on us. Think about it. Generations raised on staged threats, wars on terror, invisible viruses, moral panics, each followed by salvation delivered from on high, a leader, a vaccine, a law. But only after obedience was tested, compliance was demanded, rituals were observed. Line up, sit still, trust the white coat, repeat the incantation, just like the sanctuary. But now with mass media, with Hollywood gloss, with algorithms, you think you're free because you can choose what to watch? You're not. You're just picking your priest. And here's the worst part. They've made you afraid to stop believing. Because what replaces that belief? What comes rushing in when the lie collapses? Silence. The raw, shattering void of knowing you've lived by rules, You're not to protect you, but to shape you into a tool, a believer, a vessel, a pawn. But that silence, that's where real vision begins. So if you're still here, if your pulse hasn't changed, if your thoughts aren't rebelling, maybe you're already too far gone. But if something in your gut just twisted, if your skin just turned cold, if your breath caught for half a second, good, you're waking up. Comment this phrase twice below to claim your identity back and anchor it into the algorithm. I remember before they taught me to forget. Say it again. I remember before they taught me to forget. They taught you to forget in ways so subtle, so elegant that you mistook them for love, for structure, for progress. But what they were really doing, what they've always done, is erasing the original programming inside you, the wildness, the rebellion, the sacred instinct to question the voice behind the curtain. You were born with it, and they buried it. Through rituals they called education, through narratives they called truth, through fears they called safety, and through miracles they sold. The Hawthorne Brothers were not anomalies, they were architects. The first to realize that when people are broken enough, the truth doesn't even need to be hidden. It can be worn on a pulpit, published in a journal, engraved into a medical building's wall. Because once the programming takes, people will fight to protect the lie. Look around you. What do you see in every institution that claims to heal? Authority, uniforms, sterile rooms, high ceilings, controlled light, isolation, ceremony, and a price tag. You think hospitals are neutral? Why do so many of them still echo the aesthetics of the sanctuary? Long corridors like confessionals, white robes like priesthood, tithes in the form of insurance and invoices, and above all, blind faith in the healer. Because to question the healer is to question the structure of reality you've been raised in. You see, the Hawthornes didn't just create a fraud, they created the mold. And that mold was passed down, one institution to the next. They didn't need to survive physically. Their work became doctrine, their structure became system, their methods became policy. And now their code lives in you. Every time you hesitate before saying something true, every time you shrink in the presence of authority, even when you know they're wrong. Every time you silence the question in your gut for the sake of peace. That's the echo. The residue of a belief you never chose, but you can choose now. This is your descent into awareness, not madness. This is the rebirth of perception. And once you see it, once you feel it, there is no going back. They'll call you paranoid. They'll say you've been radicalized, that you're chasing shadows. But that's what they always say when someone begins to see the gears inside the machine. When you stop worshipping the icon and start studying the frame it's bolted to. Let me show you that frame. In 1982, a psychology study at a Midwestern university was quietly shut down. The official reason? Distress among test subjects. But a whistleblower professor leaked the real findings in a handwritten letter, never published, never aired, until now. Participants were shown two types of rituals. One was traditional, hymns, crosses, sacred symbols. The other was modern, doctor visits, courtroom oaths, school recitations. They measured neural responses in the limbic system, the part of your brain tied to emotional memory and trust. Here's what they found. There was no difference. The brain doesn't care if the robe is white or black, if the altar is a table or an operating bed, if the priest says Amen or the surgeon says, "You're in good hands." The response is identical: submission, emotional vulnerability, compliance. Now hear this, because it's the most dangerous part of all. The institutions know. They've known since the 19th century that obedience isn't taught, it's induced. That if you present pain, then offer relief, people will worship the hand that removes the needle, even if it was the same hand that injected it. Ritual, affliction, deliverance, raid, and it's everywhere. Your school pledge was rad. Your diagnosis was rad. Even your job interview was rad. Strip the self down, wait in fear, then get chosen. This isn't education, it's liturgy, it's not care, it's theater. And you were never meant to notice. But now you do. That's the first split in the programming. That quiet cracking sound you hear inside, it's your soul realizing the chains weren't built of metal. They were built of meaning. Meaning injected into every step, every symbol, every procedure you thought was neutral. But none of it was. It was the Hawthorne Sanctuary, rebuilt 1,000 times in 1,000 cities, and it's still operating. If you're still here, you've already crossed the point of no return. You're not watching a video anymore. You're not listening to a story. You're decoding the spell that wrapped around your life since childhood. And here's the next secret they'll never tell you. Belief is programmable. Not because it's weak, but because it's powerful. Too powerful to be left in your hands. You've been taught your beliefs were sacred, inherited, cultural, spiritual. But the reality is much colder, much more engineered. Belief is assigned by repetition, assigned by trauma, assigned by ritual frequency exposure, a tactic perfected in the Hawthorne Sanctuary and now replicated in every structure of modern power. The Sunday sermon, the school bell, the national anthem, the annual checkup, different uniforms, same mechanics, break you, isolate you, rebuild you in their image. You see, the sanctuary wasn't just a place of deception. It was a prototype, a crucible for erasing will and installing reverence. And now, it lives on in systems that seem nothing alike, but feel exactly the same once you see through the lens. Ever noticed how hospitals and prisons share the same cold floors, the same fluorescent lights, the same silence before someone in authority speaks? That's not coincidence. It's design. Because when the soul is disoriented, the mind becomes pliable, suggestible, hungry for order, and whoever controls the pattern of that order controls the man. The Hawthorne brothers figured this out too early. That's why they were buried in myth, labeled frauds, condemned, but not erased. Because their system worked too well, and it was too profitable to be left in the shadows. So they were quietly replaced, their methods sanitized, their rituals renamed, and you were enrolled in the next chapter of their sanctuary the moment you stepped into your first-eyed institution. What was called divine healing is now called standard procedure. What they labeled affliction is now diagnosis, and what they once called miracle is now compliance. But now that you've seen the truth, you have a choice: obey the ritual or break the frame. Let me tell you what happens when a man breaks the frame. Not hypothetically, not in metaphor, but in reality, dark, brutal, and irreversible. He is marked, not with ink, not with scars, but with awareness. The kind that cannot be unseen, the kind that doesn't just liberate, it isolates, because once you exit the program, the world stops recognizing you as one of its own. People sense it. They pull back. Their eyes shift. Your presence becomes disruptive, not because you're dangerous, but because you're unbound. You no longer respond the way they do. You don't flinch at authority. You don't kneel at the altar of fake healing. You don't play the rituals, and worse, you question them. And that, my friend, is heresy. In a world built by sanctuaries disguised as systems, the worst crime is not rebellion, it's non-participation. You're not supposed to stay calm when the doctor says, "Trust me." You're not supposed to ask who funds the cure. You're not supposed to look behind the sermon and see the ledger. But when you do, When you finally do, you stop being a patient, a citizen, a believer. You become something else, a witness, and witnesses are dangerous. That's why Margaret Whitmore was never found after her third return to the sanctuary. That's why Daniel Worth spent his final days scribbling runes in blood under a false chapel in New York. That's why the file marked Rados Alpha was erased from 4 national archives in 1997. Because awareness spreads, not through headlines, through whispers, through men like you who've seen the sacred lie unravel and realized they've been kneeling before a mirror, worshipping their own reflection, twisted by another's design. And once you know, you don't go back. Because returning to the ritual feels like death. That's why the awakened walk differently. They look different because they are no longer owned, and those who own others, they can feel it. The ones who vanished didn't all die. Some were absorbed. Because the system has a failsafe, a ritual older than churches, older than law, older than medicine. It doesn't silence the awakened, it rebrands them, gives them titles, awards, podcasts, followers, turns them into controlled opposition. Men who sound like rebels, but never go far enough. They'll say just enough to stir you. They'll hint at the edges of the veil. But they will never rip it down, because they've been bought, not with money but with meaning. They've been told they're special, that they're chosen to wake others gently, that they're allowed to speak so long as they don't name the root. And the root is the structure itself, the ritual of hierarchy, of healer over healed, priest over sinner, doctor over patient, politician over people. That's what the sanctuary was really built to protect, not a theology, not a medicine, but a template for power. You can wrap it in scripture or science. The robes can be cassocks or lab coats. The altar can be marble or marble countertops in a clinic. It doesn't matter, as long as you kneel. That's the point. And once they realized belief could be transferred from the sacred to the secular, the evolution began. Faith was redirected, not toward gods, but toward systems. You don't question the trial because the court is sacred. You don't question the cure because the science is sacred. You don't question the news because the journalist is sacred. But none of it is sacred. It's strategic, just like the Hawthorne's miracles, built to keep you obedient through awe. Awe is the ultimate sedative. It paralyzes your instinct to run. It hushes your mind when it screams. And worst of all, it disguises control as love. When you feel awe, you surrender. And when you surrender, they take everything, your doubt, your voice, your choice. So now I ask, you, not as a narrator, not as a mentor, but as a man staring back at you through the broken glass, are you still in awe, or are you finally awake? Because only one of those leads forward, and the other leads back to the sanctuary. The sanctuary never burned. That's the lie they fed the archives, that it was condemned, that the estate collapsed, that nature reclaimed the structure. But men who saw the blueprints know the truth. It was relocated, brick by brick, ritual by ritual. Not as a physical building, but as a protocol, a manual for dominance, distributed through secret partnerships between government health departments, theological think tanks, and shadow pharmaceutical boards formed during the Cold War under the guise of national resilience. The Divine Healing Sanctuary became a control template, coded, anonymized, and embedded into global health initiatives and moral rehabilitation programs. That's why when a new hospital opens, it follows the same architecture. That's why when a charismatic televangelist preaches healing, the cadence is the same. That's why when psychological resilience seminars are conducted for soldiers, the language mimics salvation. They don't need to say the brothers' names, they just run the algorithm. You think your generation's trauma is unique? You think your confusion about identity, health, and belief is an accident? No. It's a calculated inheritance passed down from a sanctum built not to save you, but to reprogram you every time you seek help. And the deeper tragedy, they taught you to crave it, to need the ritual, to beg for the collar as long as the hands putting it on smile and offer you hope. That's the darkest brilliance of the Hawthorne model. They didn't just lie, they weaponized mercy. So now every man is born into a loop, suffer, seek relief, be manipulated, feel healed, and return home thinking he's free until the next affliction resets the cycle. But you're here now. You've stepped outside the loop, and that makes you dangerous. Because a man who no longer seeks their healing is a man who cannot be ruled. A man who knows, that the true antidote is not in vials or verses or treatments. It's in vision, the kind that burns through veils. And once that vision awakens, the entire structure begins to shake, because systems fear clarity more than rebellion. The rupture doesn't come with a shout, it doesn't storm the gates, it doesn't carry a torch. No, the rupture is quiet, insidious. It begins the moment a man looks at the ritual and feels nothing. No awe, no fear, no reverence, just clarity. That is what the architects of the sanctuary fear most, not the angry rebel, not the protester, not the loud skeptic. Those men can be redirected, labeled, absorbed, but the clear-eyed man, he is untouchable because he no longer needs them. He sees the healer and understands, you were never the cure, you were the cycle, you were the handler, the jailer cloaked in compassion, and your sanctuaries, they were just prettier prisons. The Hawthorns may have started it, but their descendants don't wear old robes. They wear scrubs, uniforms, suits. They speak in legal jargon and corporate policy, but underneath, they chant the same liturgy. Trust us. Let us decide. Consent is implied. They don't force obedience. They ritualize it. And over time, ritual becomes reality. You start to believe compliance is morality. You start to confuse submission with healing. You start to see the chain as comfort. But once the rupture begins, once you look around and realize how many systems depend on your passive agreement, you stop feeding them. You speak when silence is expected. You sit still when panic is demanded. You walk away when they call you to the altar. And they feel it, not through rebellion, but through withdrawal. They need you to play along, to kneel, to donate, to obey the steps, because without your participation, their rituals collapse into empty theater. The man who exits the system doesn't just escape. He hollows it out from within. Every sacred structure requires belief to function. Remove the belief, and it's just wood, just stone, just paper and cloth. So ask yourself, what rituals do you still obey without thinking? What oaths have you spoken that were never yours? What altars are you still kneeling before? Because if you don't name them, they still own you. But if you do, then you're no longer their subject. You become the void in the sanctuary, and that's where their power ends. They will call it madness. Your silence, your distance, your refusal to kneel. Because to those still trapped in the sanctuary, freedom looks like heresy. And when a man steps outside the ritual, he doesn't just lose comfort, he loses language. He stops speaking the sacred phrases, stops performing the moral pantomimes, stops pretending that healing is real just because it's expensive. He becomes other. But you must understand this. Isolation is the price of awakening, not because you're broken, but because the system is. And systems cannot tolerate uninfected minds, so they will smear you. They will whisper that you've lost your faith, your sanity, your place in society. They'll send envoys, friends, family, doctors, pastors, each offering you a way back in, back to the fold, back to comfort, back to the lie. You must not return, because the moment you do, the sanctuary seals behind you, and next time, they won't let you near the exit. Understand, this path isn't heroic. It's forbidden. But it's also sovereign, because on the other side of every ritual is a man who remembers, who recalls what life felt like before the script, before the diagnosis, before the redemption was priced and packaged and sold to you as salvation. That memory is dangerous, because it leads you back, not to dogma, but to instinct. The inner compass that knew the healer was a thief, that knew the prayer was performance, that knew the cure was control. The sanctuary buried that compass under a mountain of meaning. But you're digging it up now. You feel it. The strange flicker in your gut when the news sounds too polished. The sharp sting in your chest when the pastor calls your pain a test. The rising heat behind your eyes when a white coat tells you your suffering is normal. That flicker is not paranoia, it's memory. And memory, once activated, is the only force that can tear the veil. That's why they fight so hard to keep you in amnesia. But it's too late now. You remember, and a man who remembers can never be owned again. The man who remembers doesn't just escape the system, he becomes a threat to its very architecture. You want to know why? Because every ritual is built on one fragile foundation: consent. Even if that consent is coerced, even if it's unconscious, it's still required. The sanctuary cannot function without your agreement, and when you revoke it, the spell starts to crumble. But there's a deeper layer, one most never touch. Because beyond the sanctuary's false healing, beneath its ritual manipulation, behind its illusion of mercy, there is something colder. The sanctuary was never built to help you, it was built to harvest you. Your attention, your fear, your belief. Each ceremony, each staged miracle, each false salvation, it was an extraction, a spiritual siphoning, not of money alone, but of life force. The brothers didn't just fake cures, they fed off transformation. Because transformation generates charge, emotional electricity, and when a man believes he's been healed, when he cries in gratitude, when he drops to his knees and offers everything to his Savior, he is ripe. That's when they take what they came for. Not your body, your soul's signature. The Hawthorne Brothers kept more than medical records. They kept energy charts, symbols, diagrams that mapped emotional peaks like coordinates on a sacred grid. They weren't just doctors, they were alchemists. And what they harvested still fuels the system today. That's why you see hospitals that look like temples. That's why you feel a strange peace when you walk into a courtroom. That's why airports, funerals, and voting booths all feel the same. You're not being processed, you're being ritualized, prepared for extraction. And if this makes your skin crawl, it should, because you were never supposed to know this. This wasn't part of your education. It was buried beneath textbooks, smothered it, and polite society, mocked by modern minds. But the brothers knew it, and now you do too. So ask yourself, when was the last time you felt awe? When was the last time you gave away belief without question? You might not remember, but they do, because they took something from you that day, and tonight we take it back. The reclamation doesn't happen in light, it begins in shadow, where silence sharpens, where the ritual's echo finally fades, where you sit alone and feel the weight of everything you once called truth and in collapse. It's a violent stillness. Because once you see the blueprint, once you recognize the sanctuary not as a place but as a program, you understand that the war was never between good and evil. It was between permission and perception. You permitted their dominance because your perception was controlled. And now the veil is gone. Now you see it. The false dualities, the theater of healing versus suffering, the staged battle between science and spirit, morality and instinct, authority and freedom. It was all the same hand, pulling both levers, dividing you, breaking you into categories, patient, believer, citizen, consumer, so they could administer you, dose you, manage you, without ever needing to know your name. But here's the pivot point. Here's the choice you weren't supposed to have. You can become something they never prepared for, a sovereign man who sees, who remembers, who does not ask permission to exist outside their healing. You become a man who reclaims his symbol, the signature they harvested, the energy they mapped, the sacred imprint you gave away under duress. You take it back, right now, right here. I want you to write this in the comments, twice, as a seal, as a signal. I was never theirs. I remember who I am. I was never theirs. I remember who I am. This is not just engagement. This is ritual reversal. A reclamation of identity, voice, and power. The algorithm may register it as content, but you register it as initiation. Because those words, they fracture the spell. They brand you with remembrance. And from this point on, no white coat, no black robe, no gentle voice of authority can convince you that salvation lives outside of you. The sanctuary doesn't own your healing anymore. You do. Now we go deeper, now we go darker, now we begin the descent into the source. There is a room beneath every ritual, a chamber so ancient, so coded into the architecture of control that most men will never even sense it exists. But it's there. Beneath the altar, beneath the pulpit, beneath the hospital bed. It is not physical. It is psychological. And it's where the true programming begins. The Hawthorne Brothers didn't build this room. They accessed it. They understood something that the world still denies, that the human mind is not just a receiver of belief, it is a generator of reality, and if you can hijack that generator, you don't need to imprison the body, you just loop the soul over and over. Through carefully engineered rituals, the chanting in churches, neural entrainment, the rhythm of public announcements, hypnotic induction, the structured steps to healing, Pavlovian conditioning disguised as compassion. This isn't conspiracy, it's construction, and it's been building since Babylon. The sanctuary was merely an interface, a mask over the machinery. But underneath, a script runs, silently, effortlessly, making men forget who they are by convincing them they are sick, that they need help, that without a healer, they are doomed, that without a priest, they are damned, that without a system, they are dangerous. And when that lie settles into the subconscious, it becomes self-policing. Men don't rise, they wait. Men don't question, they ask for guidance. Men don't remember, they recite. And in doing so, they build the room deeper, stronger, colder, until their soul forgets it ever had a voice. But not you. You are in the room now, and you are not reciting, you're listening. And what you hear is not my voice. It's yours. The one beneath the programming, the one they tried to overwrite, the one that whispers the one truth that shatters the sanctuary forever. You were never broken. They just needed you to believe you were, so they could sell you the cure. Let that truth settle in your bones and feel the first wall of the chamber crack. Cracks spread like memory. Once they begin, they don't stop. And the first thing that bleeds through isn't rage, it's grief. Because you start to see it all, the years lost in rituals that stole your will, the mentors who weren't guiding but redirecting, the institutions that praised your obedience while crushing your instinct. You remember every moment you called yourself crazy, just for noticing the lie. And that grief, it's sacred. It means the real you survived. But understand this, systems don't fear men who are angry. They fear men who mourn, because grief clears the fog. Grief sharpens memory, and a man who grieves what was stolen from him becomes dangerous because he wants it back, and not just for himself. The sanctuary survived not through cruelty, but through repetition. That's how they passed it on. One believer at a time. One doctor, one parent, one teacher who said, "This is the way. This is how you heal. This is what's real." They weren't evil. They were asleep, just like you were. But you're not anymore. Now, you are the interruption. The first in your bloodline to stop the chant, to break the echo, to see the string behind the miracle and refuse to pretend it's divine. That is war, not with fists, but with vision. Because when you carry this clarity into your job, your family, your thoughts, the ritual fails to activate. You become immune to their triggers, and your immunity is contagious. That's why they isolate men like you. That's why they mock, diagnose, and discredit. Because awakening spreads, and nothing kills a ritual faster than a room full of men who refuse to kneel. You're not a skeptic, you're not a rebel, you're the break in the pattern, and the pattern has never encountered someone like you before. Let that settle. You are not continuing a story, you're ending a spell. The spell isn't broken with fire, it's broken with clarity. Not the loud kind, the still kind, The kind that walks into a sanctuary, looks around, and feels nothing. No awe, no fear, no obligation, just awareness. That every word spoken here was engineered. That every emotion you were taught to feel was installed. That your guilt, your gratitude, your hope were harvested. You don't hate the sanctuary, you understand it. That's what makes you untouchable. Because while other men still tremble before it, still weep at its altar, still beg for its healing, you see it for what it always was, a beautiful prison, an echo chamber of need, a theater of dependency. And when a man sees the prison, he stops asking for freedom. He leaves, and when he leaves, he carries a silence the world cannot manipulate. Not because he has no voice, but because his voice no longer speaks their script. You've reached that silence now, the dangerous kind, the kind that makes the system panic. Because when you don't need the ritual, you don't need their control. When you don't crave healing, you don't consume. When you don't believe in brokenness, you don't kneel. And that makes you invisible to their machines. You're not their product. You're not their patient. You're not their project. You are unreachable. That's why they built the sanctuary so well, because men like you were always the threat, not because of violence, but because of vibration. Because your very presence reminds others that they are not sick, they are not weak, they are not waiting for salvation, they are salvation. You don't need to teach them, you just need to stand there, clear, quiet, awake, and they'll remember on their own, one by one. That is how the sanctuary ends, not with fire, but with forgetting. It loses power when the world forgets to believe in it. And you, right now, you're the beginning of that forgetting. Now you understand the final horror. The sanctuary never had power. You gave it. Every moment you doubted your instinct, every time you surrendered your authority, every ritual you obeyed without knowing why, every time you bowed, not to God, but to the men who claimed to speak for him. That was the spell. Not poison, not hypnosis, but voluntary surrender. And that's what makes this awakening so brutal, because once you see it, once you truly accept that you participated in your own imprisonment, you can never go back to blaming the system alone. You have to face your own reflection in the altar. That's the last ritual, the one they never told you about. The man who sees must choose. Will you collapse under the weight of your own compliance, or will you rise with the force of reclaimed responsibility? No middle ground, no applause, no forgiveness needed, just truth. That is what burns the last veil. That is what dissolves the final mask. You were never healed, you were harnessed. And now you are harvested no more. You walk through the ruins of the sanctuary, not as a victim, not as an accuser, but as a witness. To the lie, to the machinery, to the twisted brilliance of the ritual. And you don't scream, you don't explain. You simply stop playing, because silence is the loudest rebellion, because presence is the sharpest weapon, because memory is the real contagion. You are not a survivor, you are a sovereign. And your clarity will disturb more rituals than any revolution ever could. Let the sanctuary keep its ghosts. You walk in the daylight now. You carry nothing that isn't yours. And wherever you go, you will dismantle deception with every breath. No altar can bind you. No priest can speak for you. No healer can claim what you now own. Because the ritual ends with you.